The kettle in the study camp cafeteria screamed like it had seen the future before I did. It was 5:08 a.m. The sky outside the glass wall was still bruised blue, and I was standing barefoot on cold tile in a borrowed hoodie, watching steam crawl over a row of paper cups while my own handwriting stared back at me from the notice board. Not my name. My handwriting. Thin black loops, compressed margins, small arrows that curved like fishhooks, all copied so perfectly that for one breath I forgot I had already died once because of them. Someone had pinned a page under the camp announcement sheet, a page headed Last-Minute Constitutional Review, Authorized Copy, and beneath it, in careful ink, was the study map I had written 3 days before my first life fell apart. Only this time, I did not reach for it. I did not gasp. I did not call anyone over and make the mistake of sounding guilty before anyone had accused me. I picked up the kettle, poured hot water into a cup, and watched the top student of Blackwell Academy walk into the cafeteria with my old life folded under her arm. Her name was Vivian SAE, scholarship queen, national essay champion, principal's favorite, the girl who smiled like a public service announcement and sharpened knives in private. Behind her came half the honors cohort, sleep-creased and anxious, clutching binders, tablets, flashcards, and the dull hope that if they followed the smartest girl in the room closely enough, the entrance exam would mistake them for brilliant too. Vivian saw the page on the notice board. Her eyes flicked once to my face. I looked down into my tea as if I had not noticed that she had forged my notes, forged the camp stamp, forged my review system, and pinned it where 40 desperate students could see it before breakfast. In my first life, that page had become evidence. In this life, it became bait. No one believed I had written the notes honestly the first time. That was the part people never understood about academic betrayal. It was not enough for someone to steal your work. They had to make your own work look illegal in your hands. 2 years ago, before death folded time like paper and shoved me back into study camp week, I had been the quiet girl from the South District who kept 3 pens in her sleeve and studied until numbers appeared in my dreams. I did not have Vivian's polished mother, who sent fruit baskets to teachers. I did not have Vivian's father, who played golf with trustees. I had a grandmother who cleaned offices at night, a scholarship contract with 6 clauses about conduct, and 1 chance to sit the Crownbridge civil entrance examination. That exam was not just a test. It was the gate to the Imperial Administrative College, the place where poor girls with perfect scores became policy clerks, legal officers, ministers' aides, anything except invisible. Blackwell sent its top cohort to a closed 2-week camp every year at Lake Ardent, so we could prepare under supervision. Phones locked away, internet restricted, teachers on rotation, past papers released in controlled packets, silence after 10. It sounded strict. It sounded fair. In reality, it was a sealed aquarium where the biggest fish learned exactly whom they could eat without witnesses. Vivian had eaten me slowly. She borrowed my first-year outlines with tears in her eyes, saying her mother was ill. She copied my statutory interpretation charts because she said she learned better from my structure. She praised my case summaries in front of teachers, then repeated them first in class until everyone assumed I followed her. By the time the camp began, people already called us study partners, though partnership implied 2 people carrying weight. I carried. Vivian smiled. In my first life, I stayed until the final night of camp because leaving early meant forfeiting the authorized sitting shuttle, and every student knew the shuttle list controlled which examination paper you received. Crownbridge used 3 regional paper sets with different security codes. The camp cohort traveled together under sealed supervision. Anyone who left camp independently had to file a departure record, confirm identity at a separate center, and sit under a different verification protocol. Nobody wanted that. It sounded risky, complicated, and humiliating, especially when the teachers framed camp completion as proof of discipline. Vivian knew fear better than any textbook. On the final night, she slipped a copied bundle of my notes into my locker, then reported me for distributing unauthorized material. She had already circulated the same notes to half the cohort with her forged stamp at the top, but she told the camp director I had panicked and sold predicted answers to weaker students. The pages in my locker had my handwriting. The pages in other students' binders had my structure. Vivian cried in the disciplinary room and said she had tried to stop me because she admired me too much to watch me destroy myself. The teachers searched my bag and found a receipt for printing I had never done. They found a message draft on my confiscated phone, typed from a login Vivian had watched me enter. They found a blue pen in my pencil case that matched the forged signatures. By dawn, I was suspended from the exam, pending investigation. By noon, the cohort boarded the shuttle without me. By evening, my scholarship was frozen. The review cleared me 6 months later, after the exam cycle had passed, and after my grandmother collapsed from the extra shifts she took to cover legal fees. Vivian entered Crownbridge ranked first in our district. I entered a river on a winter night with my coat full of stones, angry not because I wanted to die, but because I could not find anywhere left to stand. The strange thing about returning to life is that the body understands before the mind does. My lungs knew air again before I remembered water. My fingers knew the camp cafeteria table before I remembered the railing of the bridge. I came back 6 days before the entrance exam, seated in tutorial room B with 38 students bent over a practice judgment, while Vivian leaned across the aisle and whispered, "Mara, can I borrow your comparative rights chart after lunch?" My name was Mara Vey. I had hated it in my first life because it looked so plain beside Vivian SAE on award programs. This time, I liked the clean edge of it. Mara meant bitter in one language, C in another, and I had been both. I turned my head slowly. Vivian's smile trembled, not because she feared me, but because she was pretending vulnerability, and performance always shook at the edges when the audience looked too long. In the front of the room, Mr. Halden discussed proportionality tests, writing neat headings on the board. Around us, students scribbled. Outside, lake light flashed through pine trees. The exactness of it should have terrified me. Instead, it narrowed the world. 6 days. 1 forged packet. 1 locked phone cabinet. 1 printing receipt. 1 shuttle list. 1 chance to leave before the trap closed, and 1 chance to make sure Vivian stepped into the trap herself. I smiled at her, soft enough for everyone to see. After lunch, I whispered back, "I'll organize everything for you." Organizing everything was easier than revenge should have been. That was the second lesson death taught me. Most traps are already built. You only need to stop struggling against them and change who is standing underneath when the rope drops. At lunch, while the cohort lined up for watery tomato soup and hard rolls, I went to the administrative office and asked for Form 17B, early independent departure, and alternate verification request. The secretary, Mrs. Olin, looked over her reading glasses as if I had requested permission to set the library on fire. Students don't leave camp early unless there's an emergency. I kept my face small and tired. My grandmother has a medical review tomorrow morning. I'm her listed contact. I'll still sit the exam through the alternate center. The lie was clean because it leaned against truth. My grandmother did have a medical review, just not tomorrow, and I had learned in my first life that people rarely questioned a poor girl taking care of family because it fit too neatly inside their idea of sacrifice. Mrs. Olin sighed, pulled out the form, and warned me that independent departure meant I would not be covered by the camp shuttle protocol. I thanked her, asked whether the form included a timestamp scan. She said yes. I asked whether the alternate center issued a separate candidate verification number. She said yes, frowning now. I said I wanted everything correct because I could not risk any irregularity. That made her soften. People loved a rule follower who feared punishment. They did not know what a rule follower could do with rules sharpened into blades. I signed the form at 12:43 p.m. Mrs. Olin scanned it at 12:47. At 12:51, a copy went to the district exam board. At 1:03, my candidate status changed from camp supervised to independent verified. At 1:05, every note I had brought to camp stopped being usable against me under the camp distribution policy because I was no longer part of the sealed cohort exchange pool. Vivian did not know that. She was still waiting by the vending machines for the comparative rights chart I had promised to organize. I gave her a chart. Of course I did. Not the real one. The real one was already in a brown envelope addressed to myself at the alternate center, witnessed by Mrs. Olin, sealed with the office stamp, and logged as personal study material for independent verification. The chart Vivian received was beautiful, precise, and poisonous. It contained no false law, because I was not foolish enough to create fake academic content that could harm innocent students. Instead, it contained my old structure from the first life, the one Vivian had already planned to forge, but this time each page carried quiet fingerprints that belonged to me legally and to her morally. I altered the order of examples in a pattern based on my birth date. I placed a tiny phrase at the bottom of page 3, review under winter protocol, even though the camp had switched to spring protocol 2 years earlier. Only someone copying from my private old drafts would reproduce it. I used a blue-black ink mixture from 2 pens, then signed my name only on a removable cover sheet, leaving the internal pages unsigned. Most importantly, I added a footnote in shorthand that looked like a memory aid, but was actually a reference to my early departure form, F17B/1247/OV. A teacher would ignore it. A student would ignore it. An investigator would not. I handed the packet to Vivian in the empty music room because she liked places where no one could overhear gratitude. Her eyes shone. "You're saving me," she whispered. That was her favorite line. In my first life, it had made me feel needed. This time, it made me aware of my pulse, steady and slow. "No," I said, smiling. "I'm just leaving things where they belong." She laughed, misunderstanding me completely, and tucked the notes into her cream leather folder. The camp changed after I filed the departure form. Or maybe I changed, and the camp finally showed its machinery. Students moved in herds, always toward whoever seemed least afraid. Vivian became brighter each hour, because theft gave her energy the way sunlight fed plants. She sat at the front of evening review and answered questions using phrases from my packet. She corrected Peter Knoll on administrative discretion with an example I had invented while sitting beside my grandmother's hospital bed. She told Mina Tran that my flowcharts were too dense for normal people, and then redrew them on the whiteboard as if simplification were authorship. Every time she used one, another student looked at her with relief. The top student had a plan. The camp had a queen. By dinner, students were asking whether Vivian would hold a final night review session. She pretended to hesitate. I pretended not to listen. At 7:20 p.m., she approached my table with 3 girls behind her and asked, loudly enough for half the dining hall to hear, whether she could adapt some of my notes for the group because the cohort was under pressure and good students helped each other. In my first life, I said yes because refusing would have made me look selfish. Then Vivian used that yes as proof that I had authorized distribution. This time, I put down my fork and let my expression fold into something embarrassed. I'm actually not comfortable distributing anything. I filed independent departure today, so I don't want my materials mixed into the camp pool. The words landed strangely. A few students blinked. Vivian's smile held. Independent departure? Why? I shrugged. Small again. Harmless again. Family issue. I'm leaving tomorrow morning. Silence widened around us. To anxious students, leaving camp early sounded like academic suicide. Vivian's eyes warmed with opportunity. "Oh, Mara," she said gently, and somehow made my name sound like pity. "You know the shuttle students get the main paper protocol, right?" I looked at her, then at the girls behind her, then back. "I know." I picked up my fork. That's why I filed correctly. By midnight, the rumors had grown teeth. Mara had panicked. Mara was quitting. Mara had lost confidence after seeing Vivian's latest scores. Mara's grandmother was sick. Mara had been called into the office. Mara had a warning letter. Rumor is lazy but ambitious. It will climb any staircase if someone points upward. I lay awake in my narrow dorm bed listening to whispers through the wall and felt something that was not anger exactly. It was the clean absence of surprise. In my first life, I thought truth would defend itself if I waited long enough. It did not. Truth was not a guard dog. Truth was a blade locked in a drawer, useless until someone chose to pick it up. At 1:16 a.m., while my roommate slept with one hand over her eyes, I slipped into the laundry room with a stack of blank paper and wrote 3 pages of notes by hand under the security camera. Not exam predictions. not case summaries. A dated memorandum to myself. At 12:43 p.m. I requested early departure. At 12:47 p.m. form scanned. At 1:05 p.m. gave Vivian SAE a private review packet with no authorization to reproduce or distribute. Internal pages contain identifying shorthand F17B/1247/OV. I wrote slowly, making sure the camera caught my posture, my pen, the pages. Then I photographed nothing because phones were confiscated and I wanted no breach. I folded the memo, slid it into an envelope, sealed it with laundry detergent residue because I had no wax, and dropped it through the slot of the admin office door. The next morning, Mrs. Olin would find it and think I was anxious. Anxious girls created paperwork. Paperwork survived when memory did not. Leaving study camp early should have felt like surrender. Instead, at 6:30 a.m., with mist unrolling over Lake Arden and the campus still half asleep, I walked down the gravel path toward the service gate carrying one suitcase, one authorized envelope, and the lightest heart I had ever owned. Mr. Halden met me by the gate because teachers liked witnessing departures that might become cautionary tales. He wore a navy cardigan and disappointment, as if both had been issued by the academy. "Mara, I understand family obligations, but you're giving up the strongest preparation environment available." I looked past him at the dormitory windows, where silhouettes had begun to gather. Vivian stood behind the second-floor glass in a pale sweater, hair loose over one shoulder, watching me like a person watching a rival step off a cliff. I wanted, briefly, to wave. Instead, I bowed to Mr. Halden. "Thank you for the instructions, sir." He softened, because politeness makes adults feel successful even when they have failed to see anything important. "Keep your materials clean," he said. "The board is strict this year." I nearly laughed. I know. The academy driver took me not to the train station, as students expected, but to the district records office because Form 17 be required in-person identity confirmation within 24 hours. I pressed my thumb to a scanner, signed the alternate candidate ledger, and watched the clerk place a red sticker on my file. Verified outside camp protocol. That sticker was small enough to fit under a fingernail. It was also large enough to split my life away from Vivian's. While Vivian became queen of the camp, I became a ghost with receipts. I checked into a cheap guest house near the alternate exam center, the kind of place with floral curtains, a front desk bell shaped like a mushroom, and a manager who treated students like migrating birds. I slept for 4 hours. I ate noodles from a paper bowl. I reviewed only the materials I had sealed before leaving, then forced myself to stop because the first life had taught me that panic studying often feels like work while quietly breaking the mind that has to perform. At 4 p.m., an email from the district board arrived confirming my independent candidate number. At 4:12, Mrs. Olin forwarded me a scanned acknowledgement of my overnight memo because anxious girls with paperwork made secretaries protective. At 5:35, Mina transcended a message through the approved camp portal. "Are you okay? Vivian says you gave her your final prediction packet before you left. She's doing a review tonight. Everyone's going." I stared at the message long enough for the screen to dim. Then I replied, "I did not authorize any group review using my materials. Please study from official packets only." It was tempting to warn her harder, to save everyone from the blast radius. But warnings sound like jealousy when the thief is admired and the victim has already been painted unstable. I sent the message anyway because I refused to become someone who let innocent people burn without at least pointing toward the exit. Mina read it. She did not respond. Later, I learned she printed my message and kept it folded in her dictionary. It saved her. Vivian's final night review became legendary before it became evidence. Students gathered in the West Lecture Hall under yellow lights, 40 chairs filled, windows black with lake darkness. She stood at the podium wearing a white blouse, the same one she had worn in the first life when she cried in the disciplinary room. On the board behind her she wrote, "Crownbridge Final Strategy, High Yield Only." Then she opened the cream leather folder and began distributing copies of my packet. Not pages she had rewritten in her own words. Copies. The exact internal order, the winter protocol phrase, The F-17B shorthand she did not understand, the birth date pattern, even a tiny pressure mark where my pen had hesitated after the word jurisdiction. To make herself look generous, she told them she had compiled the packet from various peer contributions and private coaching sources. To make herself look ethical, she added that she was sharing it because merit meant lifting the cohort. To make herself look safe, she held up a stamped cover sheet. That cover sheet was the mistake. Vivian had forged the camp authorization stamp too confidently. The stamp she used belonged to the office drawer as it existed in my first life, slightly chipped on the left border. But that drawer stamp had been replaced 3 months before this timeline's camp because Mrs. Olin complained about ink bleeding. The new stamp had a clean border and a different registration number. I knew because I had asked Mrs. Olin to stamp my early departure envelope that afternoon. Vivian did not. She had copied from memory, from old scans, from whatever illegal archive her family's private tutor had collected over years of camp gossip. Under the lecture hall camera, in front of half the cohort, she pressed a dead stamp onto stolen notes and called it generosity. The investigation began before sunrise, though Vivian did not know it. At 5:50 a.m. on the final camp morning, Mina Tran knocked on Mrs. Olin's office door with 3 pages in her hand and the expression of someone who had spent the night choosing between fear and survival. Mina was not brave in the theatrical way people praise later. She was practical. She had compared my message to Vivian's packet. She had noticed the shorthand. She had also noticed that Vivian's authorized packet included a note about winter protocol, even though Mina, whose brother had sat the exam last year, knew the protocol had changed. She did not accuse Vivian. She asked whether the packet was official. That was enough. Mrs. Olin checked the stamp first because secretaries know their own tools better than directors know their policies. Then she checked the distribution log. No entry. She called the camp director. The camp director called the district board because unauthorized exam-adjacent materials during sealed camp triggered mandatory reporting. By 6:40, 2 board compliance officers were on a video call. By 7:15, Vivian's lecture hall footage was flagged. By 7:30, my early departure file, scanned the previous day, sat beside Vivian's forged packet on a conference table. By 8:05, the officers had the memo I wrote in the laundry room, complete with camera footage showing me creating it after filing departure. The timeline did what I could never do in my first life. It spoke without shaking. At camp breakfast, Vivian performed Innocence for an audience that still belonged to her. I heard about it later from 3 different students, and each version had the same shine. She entered late, apologized for over-preparing, and joked that if the exam did not include proportionality, she would personally sue the board. People laughed because fear loves confidence. Mr. Halden announced that the shuttle would leave at 9 o'clock sharp. Students checked bags, admission slips, pencils. Vivian moved from table to table collecting praise like signatures. Peter thanked her for the review. Jessa said she finally understood emergency powers. Lena asked whether she thought Mara would even sit the exam after leaving. Vivian sighed. "I hope she does," she said, voice gentle enough to bruise. "She works hard. She just struggles under pressure." That line reached me through Mina's later retelling and made me sit very still in the guesthouse dining room, one hand around a chipped mug of coffee. Struggles under pressure. In my first life, those words became the story attached to my name. Mara worked hard, but Mara panicked. Mara was bright, but Mara cut corners. Mara could have succeeded, but Mara broke. This time, I was 2 towns away, registered, rested, and eating toast while Vivian built the exact sentence that would collapse on her head. The shuttle did not leave at 9 o'clock. That was the first crack the cohort saw. At 8:52, the camp director boarded the bus and asked Vivian to step down with her materials. Everyone watched through the windows. Vivian laughed at first, assuming scholarship queens did not get summoned. They got consulted. She carried her cream folder down the aisle while students whispered. Outside, 2 compliance officers stood beside Mrs. Olin and Mr. Halden. One officer held a tablet. The other held a sealed plastic evidence sleeve. Vivian's smile faded only when she saw the sleeve contained her review packet. I wish I could say I felt triumph imagining that moment. Mostly, I felt the old river loosen its grip around my ankles. She had stood in rooms like that before and cried her way through them. She tried again. Witnesses said tears appeared almost instantly, bright and perfect. She said she had only wanted to help. She said Mara gave her the notes. She said everyone shared materials. She said the stamp must have been on the cover sheet already. She said if there was confusion, it came from Mara leaving early and failing to communicate. In my first life, her crying had filled the room, leaving no air for facts. This time, the officer let her finish, then asked why materials supposedly given freely by an independent candidate after 1:05 p.m. carried a forged camp authorization stamp dated 11:30 a.m. Vivian stopped crying. Not gradually. Not dramatically. The tears simply lost their job. At 9:18, while Vivian sat in the camp office under supervision, the cohort was told to remain on the bus without opening any study materials. At 9:26, compliance officers began collecting every copy of the packet from student bags. At 9:41, students who voluntarily surrendered copies and confirmed they had received them during Vivian's review were allowed to continue to the exam under incident notation. At 9:55, Mina Tran's earlier message record was added to the file, and she was cleared as a reporting witness. At 10:03, Vivian's admission was suspended pending emergency review. At 10:15, the shuttle finally left without her. The exam began at 11 o'clock. Across town, at the alternate center, I sat at desk A12 under fluorescent lights beside a retired accountant and a boy from another district who tapped his foot until the proctor threatened to move him. My paper seal was green, not blue like the camp cohorts. My candidate number was different. My hands were steady. When the proctor said begin, I turned over the booklet and saw the first question, Administrative Discretion in Emergency Housing Allocation, with a subpart on proportionality and procedural fairness. A laugh tried to climb out of my chest. Vivian's packet would have helped if she had been allowed to sit. But she had not stolen it to learn. She had stolen it to own. There is a difference. Learning changes you. Ownership without labor only makes you careless. The exam itself was not cinematic. No music swelled.
No ancestors whispered answers.
My pencil cramped during question 3. I misread one statutory date and had to cross out 4 lines. The retired accountant beside me coughed every 9 minutes with the precision of a clock. Halfway through, rain began hitting the windows, soft at first, then hard enough to blur the street outside. I wrote until my fingers went numb, not perfectly, not magically, but honestly. That mattered more than I expected. In my first life, after the accusation, I had replayed every hour I ever studied and wondered whether effort could be stolen, so completely that it stopped belonging to the person who made it. Sitting there, building arguments from memory and discipline, I understood the answer. Vivian had stolen pages. She had not stolen the nights my grandmother fell asleep in a chair while I studied beside her. She had not stolen the little mental shelves where I kept doctrines sorted by use. She had not stolen the stubbornness that made me rewrite a bad paragraph 6 times instead of calling it fate. A forged note can imitate structure. It cannot reproduce the mind that survived making it. When time was called, I placed my pencil down and felt no fireworks. Just a quiet click inside me, like a lock opening. By the time I returned to Blackwell 2 days later, the school had become a theater of edited loyalties. Students who had worshipped Vivian now spoke of her in careful passive sentences. Mistakes were made. Materials were circulated. The situation was unfortunate. Nobody wanted to admit they had followed her because they were afraid to trust themselves. Nobody wanted to admit they had doubted me because doubt costs less when aimed at a poor girl. The principal called me into his office with Mr. Halden, Mrs. Olin, and a district board representative present on screen. In my first life, that office smelled like leather polish and judgment. This time, it smelled like overwatered plants. The principal folded his hands. Mara, we want to acknowledge that your early departure documentation helped clarify a serious breach.
Clarify.
Such a clean word for dragging a knife into daylight. The board representative, a woman named Director Pell, was less decorative. She said Vivian SAE had been found responsible for possession and distribution of forged authorized materials, falsification of a camp stamp, misrepresentation of authorship, and attempted attribution of misconduct to another candidate. Her exam admission for the current cycle was revoked. She was barred from sitting any Crownbridge entrance exam for 3 years, with reinstatement requiring ethics review. Blackwell's scholarship committee would conduct its own hearing. "You are not under investigation," Director Pell said, looking directly into the camera. The sentence was only 5 words. "In my first life, I would have sold my future for them. In this life, I nodded once. Thank you for confirming that." The apology came from Mr. Halden after the meeting, in the corridor between the office and the trophy case, where Vivian's debate plaque still hung. He walked beside me with the stiff discomfort of an adult who had mistaken politeness for justice and now had to stand near the result. "I should have asked more questions," he said. I could have comforted him. Girls like me are trained to do that, to make authority feel forgiven before authority has repaired anything. Instead, I looked at the trophy case. Vivian's photograph smiled from behind glass, chin lifted, eyes bright, a gold plate under her name. "Yes," I said. Mr. Halden inhaled. Maybe he expected more. Maybe he deserved less. "I'm sorry," he added. This time I looked at him. "Apologies are easier before the river," I said quietly. His face changed, not because he understood the reincarnation hidden inside the sentence, but because pain does not need translation to be recognized. I left him there with the trophies. Later, he submitted a statement supporting reforms to camp material logs, phone access audits, and mandatory dual verification for accusations involving handwritten work.
Good.
Like guilt due labor. It was more useful than sympathy. Vivian's family tried to turn the story before it hardened. That was predictable. Her mother requested a private meeting with the principal and arrived wearing pearls large enough to count as witnesses. Her father called the board decision procedural overreach. Their lawyer suggested Vivian had been the victim of a malicious setup by a jealous peer who left camp under suspicious circumstances. For 48 hours, the school held its breath to see whether money could bend the truth back into a comfortable shape. It could not, because paperwork is not emotional. The forged stamp did not care about Vivian's tears. The video did not care about her scholarship history. The timeline did not care about her father's donations. Mrs. Olin's replacement stamp invoice sat in the file beside Vivian's forged cover sheet like a small, rectangular executioner. My Form 17B scan preceded her distribution. My laundry room memo named the identifying shorthand before the packet was reported. Mina's message proved I had warned against using my materials. The camp footage showed Vivian claiming compilation credit. The students, eager now to stand on the safe side of truth, confirmed she led the review. By the 3rd day, Vivian's parents stopped threatening and started negotiating language. The board refused. The official notice used the words forged, unauthorized, and barred. I read it 3 times on the student portal, not because I needed proof she had fallen, but because I needed proof the world could record the right name under the right crime. Vivian found me behind the library on the 4th afternoon, because humiliation makes people seek private exits even when they deserve public doors. The library garden had stone benches, winter bare roses, and a fountain drained for maintenance. I was sitting with an official practice book open on my lap, though I had not turned a page in 10 minutes. She appeared at the path entrance, wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. Without the orbit of admirers, she looked smaller, not weaker exactly, but unfinished, as if the version of her everyone applauded had been assembled in other people's eyes and could not stand alone. "You planned this," she said. "No tears now." Her voice was flat, which was closer to honesty than I had ever heard from her. I closed the book. "You forged my notes. You knew I would." "Yes." Her mouth tightened. "So you trapped me." I thought of the river. I thought of my grandmother's hospital hands. I thought of 6 months of being called unstable while Vivian wore my future like a medal. "No," I said. I labeled the floor. "You chose where to step." She laughed once, sharp and ugly. "You think you're better than me because you're quiet? You think suffering makes you pure?" That surprised me enough to make me answer slowly.
No.
I think suffering made me organized. For a second, hatred passed over her face, so naked it almost looked like fear. I'll appeal. You should, I said. Every appeal adds your documents to another permanent record. She stared at me then, really stared, as if seeing not the girl she could borrow from, not the scholarship case, not the convenient shadow, but the person who had returned from somewhere she could not imagine and brought receipts. She left without another word. My grandmother cried when I told her I had sat the exam cleanly, not loudly. She never cried loudly, because life had taught her walls were thin and landlords listened. She sat at our kitchen table with a towel over her work uniform, hands red from cleaning chemicals, and pressed the heel of her palm under one eye. You left the camp? She asked, because that was the detail adults heard first. I nodded. Properly. With forms. She gave a wet laugh. Of course with forms. Then I told her about Vivian being barred. Not everything, not the river, not death, not the way time had opened its mouth and returned me to a cafeteria kettle. Just enough. Someone forged my notes. I protected myself. The board believed the evidence. Grandma listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my wrist. Good, she said. People think kindness means wishing no one punishment. My grandmother knew better. She had cleaned offices where men left crumbs on desks and called her family. She had watched respectable people steal wages in polite language. Good, she repeated stronger. A person who steals your bread will call you cruel for locking the cupboard. That line stayed with me longer than any exam doctrine. It sounded like a law older than courts. The part nobody saw was the hour after the shuttle left, when Vivian remained at Lake Ardent with her folder taken away and her future suddenly dependent on the same rules she had always believed were decorations for other people. Later, Mrs. Olin told me only what she was allowed to tell, and Mina filled in the human parts. Vivian demanded to call her father first, not a lawyer, not a guardian, her father specifically, because power had always arrived for her wearing his voice. The compliance officer said calls would be permitted after the emergency candidate review, and Vivian looked at him as if he had spoken in a language used by furniture. She asked whether they understood who her family was. She said the district board chair had attended dinner at their house. She said Blackwell would regret humiliating its highest-ranked student days before the exam. The officer typed while she spoke. That, Mina said, was when Vivian became truly frightened. Not when they accused her. Not when they took the folder. When she realized every sentence she threw into the room was landing somewhere permanent. People like Vivian are raised to believe speech disappears after it does its work. Compliments, threats, apologies, denials. All of them tools to reshape the next 5 minutes. Bureaucracy terrified her, because bureaucracy remembered. The officer asked for the source of the stamp. Vivian said Mara had provided the cover sheet. The officer asked why a candidate who had filed independent departure at 12:43 would possess a camp authorization stamp dated 11:30. Vivian said she did not check the time. The officer asked why she represented the materials as compiled from her own framework if they were Mara's. Vivian said everyone knew study partners shared ideas. The officer asked for the names of the authorized sources she mentioned on camera. Vivian said she was under stress. The officer typed that too. While she was trapped in the office, the school tried to protect itself with the speed of a creature pulling its limbs away from fire. The camp director sent an announcement to parents saying an administrative irregularity had delayed the shuttle, but all eligible candidates had proceeded to the exam. Blackwell's internal chat channels were locked. Teachers were instructed not to discuss the matter with students. The West Lecture Hall was sealed for evidence collection, which made it instantly more interesting than any classroom had ever been. Students returning from the exam walked past the taped doors and whispered like children outside a haunted house. Some were angry at Vivian, but many were angry in the selfish way frightened people are angry, furious not because she forged notes but because her exposure had endangered their own clean records. I understood that anger more than I wanted to. In my first life, fear made them abandon me before the facts arrived. In this life, fear made them abandon her after the facts arrived. It was not morality. It was weather turning. That knowledge kept me from becoming drunk on vindication. I had not revealed a hidden reservoir of courage in the cohort. I had revealed a current, and everyone was swimming toward the bank that looked least likely to collapse. Mina was different, but not because she had been fearless. She called me that evening from a borrowed office phone, voice small with exhaustion, and said, "I should have answered your message." I told her she had done more than most. She said, "I only reported it because my brother nearly got flagged last year for having the wrong formula sheet." I knew the stamp mattered. That was how justice often entered a room, not riding a horse, not holding a sword, but because one person remembered a detail that made the lie inconvenient. There was another danger I had prepared for, one Vivian almost managed to use. 2 nights before leaving camp, I had noticed my locker hinge sitting half a centimeter out of place. In my first life, I missed it because I was tired and because good students are trained to trust locked things. This time, I knelt in the corridor at 2 a.m. with a torch borrowed from the emergency kit and saw a hairline scratch near the latch, thin as a cat whisker. Vivian had not planted the final packet yet, but she had tested the lock. I reported it immediately to Mrs. Olin, not as an accusation, just as a maintenance issue. "The latch seems loose. Could you log it before I leave?" She did, grumbling about old furniture. That tiny maintenance ticket became important after the forged packet surfaced, because Vivian's first written statement suggested she had seen similar materials in my locker and assumed they were approved. The compliance officers asked when she had seen inside my locker. Vivian changed the sentence. She had not seen inside. She had heard from another student. Which student? She could not remember. Had she opened it?
No.
Did she know the latch was loose?
No.
Then why had she mentioned the locker before investigators did? Silence, according to the transcript. Beautiful silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that leaves a chalk outline around a lie. The maintenance ticket did not prove she touched my locker, but it destroyed the clean innocence of her narrative. It also led the officers to review hallway footage, where Vivian appeared near my row at 1:38 a.m. carrying nothing in, carrying a flat folder out. The camera angle was poor. Her lawyer later argued it showed only a student using the bathroom. But the timestamp sat beside the forged distribution, beside the stamp discrepancy, beside my memo, beside Mina's report. Truth rarely arrives as one lightning bolt. More often it is a net. One thread can be argued with. 20 threads become weatherproof. The forged notes themselves became a lesson in vanity. Vivian had not merely copied my material, she had improved the appearance of it. My original study packets were ugly in the way useful things are ugly: cramped margins, arrows, abbreviations, stains from tea, boxes drawn crooked because I cared more about recall than symmetry. Vivian reformatted them into a glossy booklet with a title page, page numbers, and a table of contents that made the work look like something sold by private tutors for 200 credits a copy. That design choice hurt her. The board's document analyst compared the internal handwriting to the cover formatting and concluded the packet had passed through at least 2 stages: original handwritten content and later presentation processing. Vivian had claimed spontaneous peer sharing. The booklet looked manufactured. Even worse, the metadata from the camp printer showed a late-night job under a guest access code assigned to the senior dorm wing. Vivian tried to blame that on general student use until Mrs. Olin produced the printer queue request form, because the camp printers required paper ration approval during exam week. The signature on the ration slip was not mine. It was an imitation of the assistant supervisor's initials, and it was bad. Slanted wrong, pressure wrong, missing the little d he always placed after the second letter. A small thing. A devastating thing. Once the board added attempted misuse of camp printing resources, Vivian's case shifted from confused sharing to planned falsification. That phrase followed her everywhere. Planned falsification. It sounded like a locked door. I imagined her reading it on the notice and trying to find a soft synonym. There was none. My own danger was not fully gone during those first days. That is something revenge stories usually lie about. They pretend evidence, once revealed, instantly protects the victim. In reality, evidence starts a second war over interpretation. Vivian's allies tried to suggest I had manipulated the situation by giving her marked notes. One parent wrote in the Blackwell Family Forum that students from unstable backgrounds sometimes overdocument because they intend to litigate. Another asked whether scholarship students received enough ethics training before being placed among high-pressure peers. The words were polished, but the meaning underneath was old and rotten. Maybe the poor girl was clever in a dirty way. I read screenshots until my hands shook, then stopped. In my first life, I had tried to answer every whisper, chase every thread, correct every facial expression. This time, I did not feed the forum. I sent the screenshots to Director Pell with one sentence. These statements may become relevant if retaliation affects my scholarship standing. The posts disappeared by morning, not because the parents became kind, because institutions dislike liability more than they dislike cruelty. I learned to use that too. Whenever someone approached me with a soft question shaped like an accusation, "Did you know Vivian would share the notes? Why did you leave so suddenly? Were you two competing personally?" I answered with the same sentence. All relevant information is in the board timeline. Boring words. Strong walls. The more I refused to perform wounded innocence, the less fun people had trying to poke the wound. There was one person I did not expect to defend me. Adrian Cho, Vivian's debate partner and professional shadow. Adrian was the kind of boy teachers called promising because he spoke in paragraphs and never wasted charm on people without status. In my first life, he had testified that I seemed agitated during camp and that Vivian had been worried about me. That word, agitated, appeared twice in the suspension summary and stayed in my head like a fly. In this life, Adrian requested a private statement session with the board. I assumed he intended to polish Vivian's appeal. Instead, he submitted screenshots from weeks before camp showing Vivian asking whether anyone had access to old authorized packet templates. He had ignored the messages at the time because he thought she was being obsessive about formatting. He also admitted she had asked him whether the camp stamp had changed. When the officer asked why he came forward, Adrian said, "Because if I don't, she'll say I helped." It was not noble. It was useful. I accepted it as such. Later, outside the library, he caught up to me and said, "For what it's worth, I didn't know she was going to frame you." I looked at him for a long second. "But last time you would have believed her if she did." He frowned, confused by the words "last time," but not by the accusation. "Probably," he admitted. "That honesty should not have felt rare, but it did." "Then make better habits," I said. He gave a short, embarrassed nod and walked away. Months later, I heard he withdrew from Vivian's appeal witness list. A small correction in the universe. Not redemption. A correction. The official student interviews took 2 full afternoons. I was not in the room for most of them, but the transcripts later became available in summary form because my scholarship review required closure. Reading them felt like walking through a house after a storm and seeing which objects had been nailed down and which had simply looked heavy. Peter admitted he never saw me distribute anything. Jessa admitted she assumed the packet was mine because Vivian said we studied together. Lena admitted she had repeated the rumor that I was under warning without knowing who started it. 3 students said Vivian described my early departure as convenient before the investigation began, which mattered because it showed she was preparing suspicion in advance. One student, Tomas, tried to protect himself by saying everyone believed the notes were authorized because Vivian wouldn't risk her record. Director Pell underlined that sentence in the margin of the summary, and when she sent the document to Blackwell, she attached a recommendation that teachers address reputation bias during academic integrity training. Reputation bias. Another dry phrase for an ugly thing. It meant some students were trusted because they had been trusted before, and others were doubted because doubt had already settled on them like dust. I wrote the phrase in my notebook and circled it 3 times. Later, it would become the topic of my first Crownbridge policy paper. The scholarship committee hearing at Blackwell was shorter and crueler than the board review because schools care most about misconduct when it threatens their reflection in public glass. Vivian sat at one end of the long table with her parents, her lawyer, the principal, 2 trustees, and a scholarship donor who looked personally offended that her money had funded embarrassment. I attended only for my section, seated beside Director Pell as a protected candidate. Vivian would not look at me. Her mother did, constantly, with a hatred so refined it almost passed for posture. The principal asked whether I had ever given Vivian permission to reproduce my notes. No. Whether I had ever sold or exchanged predicted answers. No. Whether I had any personal conflict with Vivian before the incident. This was the trap question, the one meant to reduce structural theft into girl drama. I folded my hands. Vivian repeatedly represented my work as her own before the camp. I did not report it because I believed informal academic borrowing would be dismissed as interpersonal conflict. That belief was reinforced by the school's visible preference for her reputation over mine. The room went very still. Director Pell's mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. The donor wrote something down. The principal cleared his throat and moved on. That answer became part of the committee minutes. I requested a copy.
They looked surprised.
I had stopped being embarrassed by paperwork. After that hearing, Vivian's scholarship was revoked, but the more interesting penalty was the quiet one. Blackwell had to notify every program that had received an endorsement letter for her that an integrity finding had been entered. Not a dramatic public shaming, no newspaper photograph, no crowd gasping under chandeliers. Just letters. Clean, official, lethal letters traveling through administrative channels faster than gossip and lasting longer. Her summer internship withdrew first. Then the Youth Policy Fellowship. Then the National Debate Team placed her on review. People who had once called her exceptional began using phrases like unfortunate circumstances and pending clarification. I did not celebrate each loss. I tracked them the way a recovering patient tracks fever, not with joy, but with the grim relief that the infection was no longer being denied. Vivian had built her life on borrowed credibility, and credibility, unlike talent, can evaporate in a single verified sentence. That was the punishment she feared most. Not missing one exam. Being known accurately. Results came 3 weeks later at noon, but by 11:40 the student portal had already crashed because panic is punctual. Blackwell opened the auditorium for candidates to check together, a tradition that pretended joy was communal and disappointment was character building. I went because hiding from rooms had never saved me. The auditorium smelled like dust and floor varnish. Students sat in clusters, whispering over tablets. Vivian was not there, of course, but her absence had a shape. Her friends sat straighter than usual, performing loyalty to someone who could no longer help them. Mina waved me over.
You sat beside her.
At 12:07, the portal loaded. My candidate number appeared first, then my name, then the word passed, then a district rank that made the auditorium tilt slightly. 3. Not first. Not miraculous. Third. In another kind of story, I might have topped the nation and walked through applause like a queen. But third felt better. Third was real. Third had crossed outs and coughing accountants and rain on windows inside it. Mina passed too. Peter passed by 2 points and immediately put his head between his knees. Jessa missed the cutoff and cried into her sleeve, and I sat with her until she could breathe because she had surrendered Vivian's packet voluntarily and deserved compassion, not a moral lecture. Across the room, people began looking at me differently, but I was old enough now, in the hidden way death had made me old, not to mistake changed opinion for justice. Applause is weather. Records are climate. The week after results, I received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of my old first life suspension notice. Not literally, of course. Time had not mailed me a document from a dead future. But the wording was so close that my hands went cold before my brain caught up. Pending investigation. Unauthorized materials. Candidate conduct. Risk to examination integrity. Someone had printed the draft notice Blackwell prepared before the board cleared me, then crossed out my name in red and written Vivian's above it. At the bottom, in block letters, they had added, "Happy now?" I sat on my bed with the page in my lap and felt the room tilt. Revenge did not erase trauma. That was another lie stories told. The body did not care that the facts had changed. It remembered the shape of danger and reacted to shadows with the same chemicals it once used for knives. I wanted to tear the paper, burn it, throw it away. Instead, I placed it in a plastic sleeve, wrote the date and time received, photographed the envelope, and sent a copy to Director Pell. My grandmother watched from the doorway, face carved with worry. "You don't have to keep every ugly thing," she said. I looked at the sleeve. "I know." Then I put it in my folder anyway. Not because I wanted ugliness close. Because I had learned the difference between carrying poison and preserving evidence. One makes you sick. The other keeps the next person from drinking it. Director Pell's reply came the next morning, brisk and unsentimental. Retain original. Do not respond directly. Board will notify Blackwell regarding possible retaliation. I stared at those sentences for a long time. There was a tenderness hidden inside competent instruction, a kind people underestimate because it does not hug or soften its voice. Do not respond directly was care. Retain original was protection. Board will notify was someone stronger than me stepping between my body and the next blow. In my first life, adults had asked how I felt, then filed my pain under unfortunate. In this life, one woman used procedure like a locked gate. I began to understand why administrative law mattered beyond exams and diagrams. Rules were not justice by themselves. Bad rules could crush people. Lazy rules could hide cowards. But clear procedures, enforced by someone willing to see, could give a powerless person time to breathe. That realization changed what I wanted from Crownridge. Before, I had wanted entrance because it meant escape. Now I wanted entrance because somewhere there were other girls with forged notes in their lockers, other boys blamed for altered records, other scholarship students whose names sounded disposable in rooms with leather chairs. I did not want to become important. I wanted to become difficult to ignore. Vivian disappeared from school for the remainder of term, but her absence remained busy. Her friends cleaned her out of group chats slowly, deleting photographs one at a time, as if removing evidence of a contagious disease. Teachers stopped mentioning her rank. The debate coach replaced her name on the tournament roster with Adrian's and pretended the alphabetical order had always looked that way. At the lockers, students performed little moral plays whenever I passed. Some offered stiff congratulations, eyes sliding away before sincerity could be measured. Some overcorrected, loudly complaining that Vivian had always seemed fake, though I remembered them carrying her coffee. Some avoided me completely, because guilt dislikes witnesses.
Mina stayed.
Not constantly, not dramatically, but in ordinary ways that mattered more. She saved me a seat in library review. She asked before borrowing a pen. She showed me her source log as a joke, and then actually kept using it. One afternoon, she said, "I think everyone liked having a top student because it meant we didn't have to decide what we believed." That sentence was better than most apologies. I told her so. She blushed and changed the subject to housing deposits at Crownridge. The strangest consequence was that my notes became famous after all, but not in the way Vivian intended. Director Pell asked permission to use anonymized excerpts from the case in a board training module on document provenance. I said yes on one condition. The module had to state clearly that high-performing students could commit misconduct and that quiet students documenting themselves were not inherently suspicious. She accepted without negotiation. Months later, she sent me the final slide deck. There, in clean gray boxes, were pieces of the disaster transformed into instruction, time-stamped departure forms, source control, unauthorized reproduction indicators, forged stamp detection, witness messaging. My handwriting appeared blurred, stripped of identity, safer than it had ever been while attached to me. I thought it would feel violating. Instead, it felt like compost. Something rotten had been broken down and made useful. Vivian had tried to turn my notes into a weapon against me. The board turned them into a shield for people I would never meet. I printed the final slide with the phrase "document the timeline before defending the emotion" and taped it above my desk. It sounded cold. It saved me on days when anger wanted to speak first and risk being dismissed as noise. One evening in late summer, just before Crownbridge orientation, I saw Vivian for the last time before leaving town. She was sitting outside the closed tutoring center near Blackwell, on the low brick wall where students used to wait for rides. No cream folder. No orbit of admirers. Just Vivian, hair tied back carelessly, staring at the traffic with a paper cup untouched beside her. I could have crossed the street. I did not. Maybe that was weakness. Maybe it was the final thread of a knot I wanted cut cleanly. She noticed me when I was already too close to pretend accident. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city moved around us, buses sighing, shop signs buzzing, a child dragging a balloon shaped like a tiger. Vivian looked thinner. Not ruined. Ruin would have been too simple and too satisfying. She looked like someone who had met consequence and found it less impressed by her than people were. "Are you going to Crownbridge?" she asked. "Yes." Her jaw tightened. I would have ranked first. There it was, the old religion still alive under the ashes. I adjusted the strap of my bag. "Maybe." She laughed without humor. "You don't even deny it." "I don't need to."
You are smart, Vivian.
That was never the problem. For some reason, that made her angrier than an insult would have. Then what was? I looked at the tutoring center door, at the faded poster promising ethical excellence through premium coaching. You thought being smart entitled you to other people's labor. The traffic light changed. People crossed around us. Vivian stared at her cup. "You marked the notes because you wanted me caught." "I marked the notes because I wanted to survive you." That sentence ended the conversation. She did not apologize. I did not ask her to. Some debts cannot be paid in words, and some apologies only reopen a door the victim already escaped through. I left her on the wall, smaller in the rear view of my life than she had ever been in its center. Blackwell tried to invite me to speak at the end of year honors assembly. The email arrived with a subject line full of congratulations and a body full of careful phrasing about resilience, integrity, and overcoming adversity. I read it while standing in the grocery aisle comparing rice prices. In my first life, I would have said yes before finishing the email. I would have wanted the stage, the proof, the chance to stand where Vivian once stood and have everyone see me. This time, I wrote back asking whether the assembly would include a formal correction of the previous internal rumors and a policy announcement about camp material verification. The deputy principal took 2 days to respond. Then he asked whether I would be willing to discuss tone. I declined the speech. That was another kind of revenge, quieter but sweeter, refusing to let an institution turn my survival into decoration while leaving its machinery untouched. The following week, after Director Pell's office contacted the school, Blackwell announced new procedures anyway. All peer-distributed materials at study camp required source logs. Any accusation involving copied notes required independent timeline review before candidate suspension. Early departure students could no longer be described as irregular without evidence. Mrs. Olin received an official commendation and a raise that was probably smaller than she deserved, but larger than the school wanted to give. Mr. Halden stopped using the phrase struggles under pressure in recommendation letters. I know because Mina showed me hers. Vivian appealed in late spring. I attended the hearing by choice, not because I was required. The room was smaller than I expected, with beige walls, a humming projector, and a table where 3 review officers sat with laptops open. Vivian wore navy instead of white.
No sunglasses.
No pearls from her mother. Her lawyer argued that the penalty was excessive because no exam content had been leaked and no student ultimately gained an unfair advantage. Director Pell responded that integrity rules did not wait for a thief to profit before naming theft. Then they played the lecture hall footage. Vivian at the podium. Vivian holding the packet. Vivian saying, "I compiled this from my own framework and a few authorized sources." The room watched her younger self smile. I watched present Vivian watch herself. That was punishment in a form no board could write down. Being forced to see the exact moment you believed nobody would ever make you accountable. Her lawyer tried to suggest I had engineered the shorthand to implicate her. Director Pell displayed my Form 17B timestamp and the laundry room memo. The candidate documented identifying marks before the unauthorized distribution was reported, she said. That is protective record keeping, not entrapment. Protective record keeping. I almost smiled. It sounded so dry, so official, so much gentler than coming back from death and deciding to live with a pen in your hand like a weapon. The appeal failed. Vivian's 3-year bar stood. Her scholarship was terminated. Blackwell removed her from the honors wall after a parent complained that convicted misconduct should not hang above the ethics pledge. For once, a parent complaint improved something. Months later, Crownbridge sent my admission packet in a white envelope thick enough to feel like a door handle. I opened it at the kitchen table while my grandmother pretended to be busy cutting onions. The letter congratulated me on admission to the Imperial Administrative College, Civil Law and Governance stream, scholarship confirmed, housing subsidized, orientation in September. I read the words twice, then a third time aloud. Grandma put the knife down and sat before her knees could betray her. We did not scream. We did not dance. We had spent too long surviving to perform happiness quickly. Instead, she reached for the kettle. It began to heat with a low murmur, nothing like the scream in the camp cafeteria, and the sound filled our small kitchen as if the future had become ordinary enough to boil water in. I thought about Vivian then, not with pity but with distance. She had wanted my notes because she believed the page was the achievement. She had wanted my reputation because she believed admiration was the same as worth. She had wanted my exam path because she believed gates opened for whoever looked most entitled to enter. Maybe one day she would learn. Maybe she would not. That was no longer my assignment. On the first day at Crownbridge, I walked past the main lecture hall where portraits of old ministers stared down with oil-painted certainty. Students around me introduced themselves by district, rank, family, ambition. Some had voices polished by private schools. Some looked as terrified as I once felt. In my bag was one notebook, one black pen, one blue pen, and a folder containing copies of every document that had saved me. I no longer carried them because I expected betrayal in every room. I carried them because memory deserved architecture. At orientation, a dean spoke about public trust, ethical duty, and the danger of clever people without conscience. The speech was probably recycled every year. Still, I listened. When she said, "Systems are only as fair as the people willing to document the truth," I wrote it down. Not because it was new, because it was mine now too. After the session, Mina found me near the courtyard fountain and asked if I wanted to study together sometime. She said it carefully, like someone approaching a house that had once burned. I looked at her open notebook, her nervous smile, her hands empty of stolen pages. "Yes," I said, "but we make separate source logs." She laughed so hard a passing student stared. I laughed too, and the sound startled me. It had been a long time since laughter felt like something my body made instead of something I owed the room. I never became the kind of person who believed betrayal was a gift. People say that when they want pain to sound useful. Betrayal is not a gift. It is a theft with consequences, and sometimes the only lesson is how much repair costs. But rebirth gave me one mercy, the chance to stop begging the wrong people to believe me and start building a truth that could stand without my voice. I left study camp early, and they called it panic. I filed forms, and they called it overthinking. I refused to distribute notes, and they called it selfishness. Vivian forged my work, stood before the cohort, and called it leadership. For one night, everyone believed her. For one night, my old life repeated itself so closely that I could feel the river waiting beyond the trees. Then morning came, and the documents woke up before the liars did. The forged stamp spoke. The timestamp spoke. The memo spoke. The students who still had courage left spoke. By the time Vivian tried to put my name under her crime, my name had already walked out through the service gate, signed itself into another center, and sat down under a clean candidate number. That is what I learned in my second life. Sometimes you do not need to fight for your seat in a burning room. Sometimes you leave early, label every match, and let the person holding the stolen flame explain why her fingerprints are on the ashes. The Crownbridge orientation did not fix me overnight. For the first month, I sat in every lecture hall with my back near a wall, counted exits, and wrote my name on every page in 2 places. When classmates asked to compare outlines, my throat tightened before I could answer. I wanted to be generous. I also wanted to never again see my handwriting held up by someone else as proof of their brilliance or my guilt. So, I built rules that let me stay human without becoming careless. I shared summaries only after dating them, saved drafts in a cloud folder with version history, and asked classmates to contribute their own sections before seeing mine. Some people thought that was intense. Fine. Intense kept me alive. Mina understood immediately. She called our shared system paranoid friendship and made a spreadsheet so ugly it became beautiful. Slowly, other students joined because the system worked. Nobody had to wonder who wrote what. Nobody had to perform trust as a substitute for clarity. By midterm, our small group had the cleanest source logs in the cohort, and a teaching assistant asked whether she could show our method to first years next term. I said yes, then went to the bathroom and cried for exactly 3 minutes because healing sometimes arrived dressed as embarrassment. I was not crying for Vivian. I was crying for the girl in my first life who had believed that asking for credit made her selfish, that protecting her work made her suspicious, that kindness required leaving every door unlocked. I wished I could hand that girl a dated folder and a pen. I wished I could tell her that trust without records was not nobility when the room was full of people trained to doubt her. My first Crownbridge assessment returned with a mark high enough to make my professor write, "Excellent structure" in the margin. Those 2 words should have been simple. Instead, they opened a trapdoor under my ribs. Structure was what Vivian stole. Structure was what teachers praised when it came from her mouth and questioned when it sat in my locker. I carried the paper to Director Pell's office, even though she was not my mentor and technically owed me nothing. Her assistant recognized me and waved me in after a short wait. Director Pell read the margin, then looked at my face. "You don't seem pleased." I hated that she noticed. I hated more that I was grateful. "I am," I said. "I just keep expecting someone to say it isn't mine." She leaned back, not softening, which helped. "Then build a professional record so boringly consistent that accusation has nowhere dramatic to attach." She tapped the paper. "You are already doing it." That became another sentence I kept. Boringly consistent. It did not sound heroic, but heroism had nearly killed me.
Consistency had saved me.
I returned to my dorm and filed the assessment behind my admission letter, my Form 17B copy, and the anonymous training slide. Not a shrine. A foundation. There is a difference. Before the first winter break, Blackwell invited Crownbridge students back for a mentorship panel. I declined twice, then accepted after learning the new study camp cohort would attend. Standing in the renovated auditorium, I did not tell them a dramatic story about betrayal. I told them practical things.
Keep drafts.
Date your work. Do not lend original notes to someone who only respects boundaries after they are enforced. Report missing pages before they become accusations. If a star student pressures you to trust them more than the policy, choose the policy. The room was quieter than teenagers usually allow. At the end, a girl in the back raised her hand and asked, "Doesn't that make people think you don't trust them?" I looked at her, at the anxious intelligence in her face, and answered the question I wish someone had answered for me. People worth trusting will not ask you to become unprotected to prove it. She wrote it down. That was enough. I left that auditorium lighter than I entered it. Not healed completely, not beyond fear, but no longer carrying the lesson alone. Sometimes survival becomes useful only when it stops being a secret. And for the first time, I believed my future could be more than self-defense. Years later, when I became the kind of official students wrote nervous emails to, I kept one framed document behind my desk. Not my Crownbridge admission letter. Not my district rank. Not my first appointment certificate. Form 17B, Early Independent Departure and Alternate Verification Request, scanned at 12:47 p.m., with Mrs. Olin's tidy initials in the corner. Visitors thought it was a joke or some obscure bureaucratic charm. I never corrected them unless they asked. To me, it was proof that escape could be active, that leaving could be strategy, that a girl walking away with a suitcase at dawn might not be surrendering at all. She might be moving the battlefield to a place where truth had better lighting. And whenever a student sat across from me with shaking hands, saying someone powerful had taken credit, changed records, twisted witnesses, or made them sound unstable, I never told them to calm down. I never told them truth would win on its own. I slid a blank sheet of paper across the desk and said, "Start with the time, then the place, then who is there. We will give the truth somewhere to stand." because that was the real revenge Vivian never understood. She thought she had stolen my notes. Instead, she taught me how to write evidence. She thought she had barred me from the exam. Instead, she pushed me toward the work of making sure the next girl did not have to die before anyone checked the stamp.